What's up, YouTube? It's Winston, and you're watching Fancy Boy Jeeps. So today is part 2, the Metalcloak shocks and springs. I actually got them installed. I put together a little bit of a video, or at least I started to, that kind of shows me and my crew kind of putting stuff together. Unfortunately, the lift was a little bit more intrusive than I thought, and I had to actually get my hands dirty, so I wasn't able to really record a whole lot. I was able to get a good bit of the front axle, none of the back axle, but I wanted to take this time to let you see what I have, and then also kind of go into some detail on some of the things that I talked about in the video, and also show you some things that you're going to need when you decide down the line to disconnect and actually install your new stuff. So take a look at this video. Alright guys, so time to start. Go ahead and then get working on this lift. One of the first things that I'm going to do is spray everything down with some PB Blaster just to make sure everything is loose for me. My Jeep is from the north, so since it's from the north, I do have some rust issues on like bolts and things and getting stuff off. So we're going to go ahead and hit everything with some PB Blaster. That way we can make everything a lot easier. I'll show you some of the places that I already hit so far. That way you can take a look at areas that you should probably be hitting once you decide to install your lift as well. So it's recommended for you to hit your lower control arm and also your shock bracket. This just makes it so that when you go in to droop down your axle to install your springs and take out your old springs, it makes it a little bit easier to remove things. So I did that on again, the lower control arm and the shock bracket on both the driver and the passenger side. I also did where my tie rod goes in. If you can see that, yeah. Did where my tie rod goes in just in case. So I did that on both the front and the rear. Moving to the back of the Jeep. On the back of the Jeep, I did the shock bracket as well, but I also did the sway bar disconnect there, simply because we never take that off, so it's always been on, so I'm going to assume it's going to be pretty hard to get off. We're going to disconnect the sway bars in the front to let it droop down, so obviously in the back probably going to need to do the same thing, so I just went ahead and sprayed that. I chose to go at a different angle to disconnect for the lower control arm. I chose in front of the tire. It just seemed like it was a little bit easier to get to here. Sorry, here, and then under the Jeep over here as well. I don't really know if the camera's gonna pick that up, but right there. So I did that on both the driver and the passenger side in the rear. The recommendation that I got as far as PB Blaster is every 5 minutes for 30 minutes. So 5 minutes is up, time for me to hit it again. All right, so now that you have sprayed everything down, it's time to lift the Jeep up. You're gonna have a lift over here and a lift on that side to lift up the body of your Jeep. And then you're gonna take that jack there and put it here on your differential, which is gonna allow for you to articulate your axles enough to pop your old springs out and put your new springs in. So 3 jack stands there, and this one goes right there.
All right, just now I got the shock bolt bottom part undone, and I'm just trying to figure out what is putting tension on the bolt for me to be able to slide the bottom bolt out. I got the nut off, but I got to get the bottom bolt out now.
All right, got the shock out by using a little, another little bolt to pop that in. Now we're just taking off the brake and the caliper so that we can drop the axle down. We're gonna take this little screw out here, which is gonna allow us to remove this whole little bracket out and allow for more down travel. Like I said, man, it's a very quick video, really just talking about and showing you some of the things that I had to do to kind of prepare for the lift. I told you in the video for the rear control arm I ended up doing the bottom part, but once the tires were actually off, I ended up doing the top part of the control bar. It's really hard for you to see on the video, So because of the tire, so I'm not gonna, take any time to really kind of try to show you where it is, because just trust me, it's there and it's hard to find, especially with the tire on. I took some notes on some things that I think are really, really important when it comes to making sure you're safe when you're doing the lift, and also just some quick pointers to kind of give you, when you decide down the line to lift your Jeep, something that's going to help you out. The first of which being, make sure that you have enough jack stands for your Jeep. And then what we used actually is a high jack lift. We put it on the high jack lift mount spot on my Jeep. We did that primarily so that if anything failed on the jacks, that it would get caught by the high jack before just dropping all the way down with no tires on it or someone being under the Jeep. So make sure that you have enough jack stands and even a high jack lift if possible to kind of support the Jeep when it's up in the air, okay? Something else is make sure that no one's under the Jeep whenever you go to decide to lower it. When you do take it off the jack stands and your tires are on there, do it slowly, okay? Make sure you get the jack and slowly let it down, and make sure that everyone is out. Make sure that there's no parts under the Jeep. That's a very, very key safety item, okay? Speaking of parts, when you take parts off, a lot of these parts you're gonna reuse. When you get your stuff in, you're gonna notice that they don't have a lot of bolts because you're gonna reuse a lot of things. So be sure to keep up with all your bolts, all your washers, all your nuts, put them together and leave them around the area that you're gonna be working on for that specific side. To me, that worked out really well. We didn't have to spend too much time looking for any extra bolts or screws or anything. We knew where everything was. So that's a very, very key, important, don't forget type of thing, okay? To manipulate and get your control arms out, one thing that we ended up doing was we used a ratchet strap. We put it around one of the axle shafts and then towards the frame of the body, and use that to move the axle forward to allow it to drop the control arms out, especially at the front. Once we were able to do that, it allowed the Jeep to really articulate so that we can get these springs in. Here in a minute, I'm gonna show you something that's important for the springs primarily, because if you don't do this one thing correct, you run the risk of your spring popping out, not sitting correctly in its place, and this is something that I didn't know and someone else pointed out to me, and I'll show you now. So what happens is when you put the spring in, you'll rotate it around and you'll notice there is a little clip in right here. Make sure that you turn that spring into that little part right there. That is a very important thing. I'm not too worried about my springs popping out now because I have the bump stops in there. As you can see, those two, we did 2-inch bump stops. That's just gonna connect and hit that top bump stop right here when I'm flexing so that my wheel doesn't get up into my fender. But again, making sure that you get this slid in and rotated around is a big deal. There's also, you're not gonna be able to see it, but there's also, I'll see if I can try to show you. There's also a spring retainer up in there. Yeah, you can't see it. There's a spring retainer in there. Ensure that you keep that. That's gonna keep your springs at the top in place. There's some in the front and some in the rear. So make sure that you keep those as well, okay? We also disconnected the front and rear track bar. Something that I recommend is you tighten it once you're done with the lift. Put your track bars on, tighten it just enough to have it tight, and then lower it and drop it on the ground and put all your wheels on the ground, and then torque it. Torquing it in the air is kind of a bad decision. It does make it a little bit more difficult in the rear to get to when it's on the ground, but it's certainly worth it, okay? Speaking of torquing, make sure to torque your tires. I'm not gonna throw my boy under the bus, but just make sure to torque your tires when they're back on. You can tighten them with whatever you need to, with the air socket if you want, but just remember, if you're gonna use, number one, if you're gonna use an air socket, make sure to put the bolt on there and twist it a little bit and then use the air socket. And after that, you need to go back in and torque it with some big tool that you have. A lot of these bolts, the replacement bolts are a lot thicker. So for you to use your normal bolt, I don't know, your normal tie rod, it's not gonna work. So you're gonna need a little bit of a bigger tool to get in there and really kind of get that thing tightened. You don't want to be driving down the road and you lose a lug nut and your tire comes off. It's bad news. So, like I said, there's a lot of things that you need to disconnect. Your control arms, front and rear, lower preferred. They're just easier. You're going to need to disconnect your brake lines, front and rear, possibly your calipers. Really just depends on how big your springs are. You're also going to have to disconnect. For me, I had to disconnect my drive shaft. You may not have to do that. It really just depends on, again, how much flex you end up receiving. Okay. And you're also going to have to disconnect your track bars, front and rear. Remember, when you put the Jeep back on the ground, that's when you need to torque it to spec. Stay tuned for next week. We're going to be doing a little bit of work on some Poison Spider rocker knockers. You know, I have them on my Jeep. We found some for my buddy. We're going to be talking about where you should look for them and how you can find some cheap deals for some fancy parts. We're going to talk about what we're using to paint them. They came in a glossy purple and a glossy black, which the Jeep doesn't match that. And we're gonna talk about how we can turn that into something that's useful for a very, very low cost price. So stay tuned for that next week. If you like this video, you found it kind of helpful, I know I didn't really get into too much detail. I do apologize about that. I promise down the line there will be a full install from a lift video, because there's always people in the club working on stuff. But like I said, if you liked the video, you found it helpful, make sure to like it. If you have any questions or comments, drop them in the comments. Hit that subscribe button. Make sure you share this thing too, man. Make sure your boys know about it. Most importantly though, keep those Jeeps fancy, boys.